right, I'd like to welcome Yaakov Katz to Noisy Reality. And we're going to talk to Yaakov today about while Israel slept, how Hamas surprised the most powerful military in the Middle East. Now, he's the co-author of this book with Amir Bohbot. Is that that's the right
hmm
pronunciation? And Yaakov is a prominent Israeli journalist. He's the former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. He has been currently working for the Jewish People Policy Institute. And through the work that he's done, Yaakov Katz and Amir have both helped co-produce really excellent looks at Israeli national security issues, such as the weapon wizards, how Israel became a high-tech military superpower, shadows strike inside Israel's mission to eliminate Syrian nuclear power, and Israel versus Iran, the shadow war. These have been invaluable for people to understand what's going on. His co-author, Amir Bohbot, is a journalist, lecturer at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, and senior researcher at Bar-Ilan University. He's covered the IDF for the last 25 years and currently works as the military and defense correspondent for Walla. So thank you very much, Yaakov, for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Jim.
All right. Well, first, let's start off with an obvious question. I'm somebody who remembers very vividly the Agranat Commission at the end of the October War. And I remember the past 50 years plus have been filled with conferences, books about let's not repeat this mistake again. You mentioned in your discussions with others the concepcion. Well, the concept, of course, that I remember going back to the previous war was the one that Israel would not have to worry about Egypt and Syria going to war unless they got air supremacy. And that, of course, was one of the conclusions of Shimon Agranat's commission, which was quite powerful. And there's lots of other issues. So here you have a military that had this lesson as a profound account. I mean, I had friends of mine who fought in the October War, both in the Golan and in the Sinai. I'm sure you're well acquainted with people who had that experience. How did a mess like this happen on October 7th? Because I read your account in the book, and I'm saying to myself, okay, they're once again underestimating their foe the way they did back in 73. And am I wrong? What happened?
Well, I think you're not wrong that there was definitely another conceptia or another complete misunderstanding of what was happening around us, and this belief in a fairy tale that Hamas, a genocidal jihadist terrorist organization, could be deterred, could be paid off, could be convinced that war and terror is not in its interest because of economic incentives. This was the misconception here in Israel, and this was the idea that if you focus on all those carrots, let's say, you won't have to use the stick. But what Israel misunderstood, I think, is that that's not sustainable. And for that reason, what Hamas was doing was actually preparing for a large scale invasion, preparing for war at a time that we thought, no, they wanted peace and no, they wanted quiet. And that was the way that no matter what came our way in terms of intelligence and signals and alarm bells and warnings, everything was misunderstood. So I like to think this wasn't a lack of information. It was more of a failure of imagination because the information was there. This was similar to an extent to what happened 50 years prior. As you mentioned, the Yom Kippur War of 1973, when Israel again, there were all these indications that Syria, that Egypt were preparing for war. But Israel believed in what one or two sources were telling it. They believed that they were stronger, that Syria and Egypt would never try to liberate the land that Israel had conquered in 1967, 6 years prior, through military force. They got that wrong too, and that led to a bloody debacle that cost the lives of 2,700 Israeli soldiers. So I think here again, the belief that Hamas did not want war led to a blindness and a lack of preparedness and to the failures and the ultimate horrific tragedy of October 7th.
Now, in your accounts that I've been watching some of the videos you've done in the United States, And of course, you quote Clausewitz, war is an extension of politics except by other means. So when you have these ideas that you are going to be able to deter a foe like Hamas, yet, and again, I don't want a Monday morning quarterback because it's easy to do that. Um, but what seems to me interesting about all this is Hamas was clearly building themselves up. The idea, what always amazed me in some of these early accounts is that they actually thought they could destabilize Israel, which I sort of found amazing that they had the intention of doing that. And the issue of coordination with other countries comes into play. Because clearly, you look at also some of the leaked information. Again, we don't know what the hell really happened because we haven't had a kind of overall comprehensive look at the classified information, such as what the Agranat Commission did, and had that
Well, we haven't
really.
had a commission of inquiry.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly, because Netanyahu knows what happened to Golda Meir, and he is obviously we can't of course ignore the politics domestically in Israel that perhaps were part of Sinwar's calculation to launch this to start with, but what about that? The coordination of the axis of resistance, the issue of attacking simultaneously Israel, because you sort of felt like the level of demobilization was so intense that perhaps if Hezbollah had been part of that surprise attack, they would have penetrated deeply into Israel at the same time as Hamas did.
Well, I mean, we now know in the aftermath of the war that Hamas had tried to coordinate this with Iran and with Hezbollah. We saw how Hezbollah joined the war on October 8th, the day after the Hamas attack. But it seemed that there was some sort of idea that maybe they would all do it together. And we can only imagine that had Hezbollah attacked also on that morning, it would have been of a whole other scale. This attack that would have come across the border. Israel was not in the right position, neither in the north nor definitely in the south, as we saw. And if Hezbollah tried to cross the border, I reckon they potentially could have made it all the way to Tel Aviv from the border with Lebanon, um, and it would have been very difficult to stop them. So, the wake up call that Israel got on October 7th, to some extent, might have actually saved the state of Israel in that sense. As terrible as that sounds, considering the horrific toll that it took on Israel, 1,200 people murdered, 251 taken into Hamas captivity. As we're speaking, 8 bodies of hostages still being held in Gaza. But the reality was that there was an attempt to try to coordinate this, but Hamas decided to jump the gun to some extent. Hezbollah got involved. Iran got involved later, and we saw the exchange of blows between Israel and Iran, and then eventually the 12-day war,
Mm.
during which President Trump sent his aircraft to also assist the B-2 bombers to help Israel in destroying the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. So this became a regional conflict. This became what Prime Minister Netanyahu likes to call the 7-front war. Israel has been fighting over the last 2 years in Gaza, in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, in Lebanon, in Syria, against the Houthis,
Mm.
against Iran, and against Iranian militias in
Mm.
Syria and Iraq. I mean, this is
Mm.
literally a
Mm.
war unlike anything that Israel has ever seen before.
Mm. Yeah, I would argue that ever since the Iranian Revolution, the United States has been involved in a multi-front war in the Middle East, along with Israel in its various battles with proxy allies of Iran. And, I go back to when friends of mine were in Beirut. A friend of mine was commanding a anti-radar battery at the time of the Marine barracks explosion. That had a tremendous effect on him. And then I think of friends of mine who were involved in the operations to overthrow Saddam Hussein. I've listened to these arguments for years. I covered the Gulf War. So to me, the United States has been involved with this, and as we know, the Gulf War. There's all the arguments about why did we overthrow Saddam, the question of aiding Israel, the whole domino effect of toppling the different powers in the Middle East, etc. The United States has been involved with this for quite a long time, decades. Uh, Now, one thing that also strikes me as interesting is the question of confronting Hamas as a military power. Because once the attack occurred, because I remember, I, for example, had Palestinians on the day after the attack occurred on radio. They all condemned what had happened that day in Israel. Rashid Halidi got on the air in New York and condemned what Hamas had done. He, of course, wanted to understand people should understand why we got to this point. And one of the things that's been particularly uh, disturbing, and I think you do recognize this, is the inability of Netanyahu to really communicate to the world throughout this conflict a fair-minded approach that deals with and counteracts the erosion of international opinion supporting Israel, which is one of the unfortunate outcomes of what has occurred. It's not like the reaction in the October War when American public opinion more or less rallied to Israel. We have a very distinct impact on this conflict in the United States. We see it in the mayoral race in New York City right now, by the way,
Right.
and also internationally. And I'm wondering how you that aspect of it. I think because you could say that that is a strategic blunder that is will impact negatively on Israel for time to come. And I wonder how you feel about that. I've heard you
Well, look,
express your opinion about that.
I mean, I believe that we're negligent when it came to the court of public opinion, and that Israel could have had what to say, had what to argue, and failed to make those arguments and failed to get its message across. And part of that has to do with structural problems within the Israeli government and a lack of awareness, a lack of investment, and not having the correct entities, and a lot of different reasons, and politicization of
Mm,
communications, and so much more. But I also think is that we can't ignore, Jim, that there is a culture of anti-Semitism in the United States as well, and in the mainstream media. There is a bias against the state of Israel. There is a double standard for the way that Israel is perceived, and the way Israel is judged, and the way Israel is looked at,
mm.
and its actions. And that will always mean that the cards or the deck will be stacked against us. I think we could have done better. I think we could have done more. And I think that the failure to do so is going to be a stain on this government. But I also think that had we even tried harder, we could have mitigated. But there was no way we were going to win in this narrative battle.
Well, let me just push back on that. I went to Columbia University, so I know very, very acutely and have watched the Arab-Israeli conflict argued about that for 50 years. I remember when I encountered a person who will remain nameless who actually became a PLO official. He mentioned to me how happy he was that we will eventually drive them into the sea. And I said to him, well, you guys haven't been too lucky about that lately. And eventually, this person was targeted by the JDL, and every Israeli veteran in the political science department at Columbia University, to a man and woman, stood up and said, leave this guy alone. You do not mess with this guy. You leave him alone. And so I have a particularly, perhaps a more complicated view about this in terms of how it's been expressed in the United States. I certainly do not deny anti-Semitism as an issue, but as somebody who has not, I'm not necessarily a fan of Netanyahu, so I don't, and I have many Israeli friends. I don't think criticizing the government and state of Israel is being anti-Semitic. In fact, I reject that out of hand, totally. However, the issue, which I do see, and I tend to agree with you, is one of the things I had a problem with after October 7th was an uncritical acceptance of Hamas. I found that to be difficult to deal with.
Right.
And I couldn't go for that. As much as I felt that, perhaps I have a kumbaya attitude, let's have peace between everybody. That I feel that's the better approach. But I realize how naive that can be. Um, but anyway, let's get back
Well,
to
I
the
wish that was the reality.
yeah, of
Unfortunately,
course, of course.
this is not. Hamas doesn't want that, right? And
Right.
that's not what this terrorist organization. I think what maybe it's important for our listeners to understand.
Mm,
They might look like you and I. They look humans. They are human. They could speak even English. Very intelligent, intellectuals. They speak and communicate well. Their values are completely different, diametrically different
mm,
than the values of the Western individual.
mm,
They, as one simple way to look at this, they sanctify death, while we in the West sanctify life. And where do I know they sanctify death? Because look at this war, right? There's an interesting something very fascinating that happened in this war. I'm talking to you from my home in Jerusalem.
mm,
If I go down 3 floors, I have a bomb shelter in the basement of my building. And that's where I go if there are missiles being launched at me, at my home, at my city, from Iran or Lebanon or Gaza for that matter. We've been there repeatedly over the last 2 years. And we built that bomb shelter, and this was built in the building for the residents of the building. Now, if you go to Gaza today, and if you went to Gaza even before the war, you had about 500 miles, 400 miles of tunnels that crisscrossed all across Gaza. It was basically the New York subway and the London Underground put together.
Mm.
Now, if we take the Hamas health ministry, which we could question whether we should believe a terrorist organization anyhow, because no one would ever quote or believe the ISIS health ministry or the Al-Qaeda health ministry.
You're talking about the casualty estimates.
Right.
Now.
But for some reason, we all accept the Hamas health ministry. So if we accept the Hamas health ministry, we take that there's about 65,000 people have been killed in this war. And again, I don't know if it's true. I don't know how many of them are combatants. Israel says that, at least 25,000 of them are combatants. Hamas, the Palestinians and Hamas don't tell us who's a combatant, who's a civilian. Right. But put that aside for a moment. Lots of civilians have been killed, unfortunately. How come they weren't allowed into the tunnels where they could have been protected, right? If the tunnels exist and they're not going to be killed there from the Israeli bombs, why did Hamas not let them into the tunnels? What were the tunnels for? They're not for the people of Gaza? So people say the people of Gaza don't have bomb shelters. Well, I mean, they have hundreds of miles of tunnels that are deep underground, 40, 50 meters underground. Why were they not allowed into there? And we know that there are shafts that go down from almost every building, every supermarket, every school, every UN compound, every mosque that connect to these tunnels. Why aren't the people allowed in there? And the answer was given to us, Jim, by a senior Hamas member who said early on in the war, the tunnels aren't for the people. The tunnels are for us, for the commanders, for the fighters, for the terrorists. Right. To use to move weapons, to hide hostages in. So what can we deduce from this or deduct from this? It's something very simple. The people above ground, their job for Hamas, they're meant to be killed. They want them to die. It serves their interest. And what is their interest? The demonization of Israel, the isolation of Israel, the turning of Israel into a pariah or isolated state. That serves their goal. So when there's a rocket launcher in a building, and every military in the world has to ask themselves the same question, is this a legitimate target according to international law? Well, the answer is yes, because it's civilian infrastructure that's been turned into a military base, and now it becomes a military target. But then you have to ask yourself questions of proportionality. Can I attack? Can I not? Is the value of the target more or less than the proportion of the collateral damage and what's going to happen to the people who are in the building? And there's always going to be different answers to all these different questions depending on the target and what the civilian death toll might be and the casualties, etc. But what we're looking at here is, why did this happen? And I think that this is where we understand how Hamas is a whole different reality than the one that you and I live in. They don't see life like we do. They don't fight to keep people alive like you and I do. It's a different value system. So we might look at them and say, "Oh no, they're people." No, they're people, but they're nothing like us.
Well, let's get into that. I remember listening to an Israeli battalion commander at the Council on Foreign Relations in 2005 talking about the tunnel warfare, which was an eye-opener to me. I mean, I wasn't aware of, I sort of read about it. I certainly did not have the conception of it that I do now. And it was obvious to me that Hamas was essentially building this incredible infrastructure underground to essentially militarily negate the advantages of the IDF as much as they could. And again, present the situation that you just discussed, that who's going to take to the hammering? The people up above. But describe how you understand in your book, and you describe it with the tunnel warfare chapter and also the chapter where the initial divisions of the IDF are coming in to actually fight in Gaza. How do you understand the IDF has dealt with this kind of situation?
Well, look, the tunnel warfare, to an extent, Israel misunderstood, I think, what was really happening. Israel believed that the tunnels that it needed to care about were just the tunnels that were coming across the border. It was the tunnels that in 2000, we saw the first time it was used was 2006 when Hamas kidnapped a soldier, Gilad Shalit, held on to him for 5 years.
Right.
But in 2014, Hamas began popping out of tunnels inside Israel. killed some Israeli soldiers, tried to abduct others. They didn't succeed. And that led Israel to invest, not only they launched an operation to destroy the cross-border tunnels, but also then to build an underground wall to block the tunnels, and then a system to detect when a cross-border tunnel is being dug. And the tunnel system is very sophisticated. It's even used by the US Army on the southern border of the United States. But where Israel did not invest the same level of resources, neither intelligence or technology, was in those massive tunnel networks inside the Gaza Strip. It knew that they were there because it had operated in Gaza, had seen these tunnels, but never really descended into them. And that's where I spoke about before the lack of imagination. It never believed, for example, that Hamas would have 251 people that it would hold inside these tunnels. And therefore, when the war breaks out, suddenly these tunnels become of strategic importance, existential importance for the people who are being held in them. But Israel doesn't really know where they are. It knows where the shafts are, but knowing where a shaft is tells you nothing about the actual route of the tunnel, where it goes, where the offshoots are, what's happening. This is a great blunder to an extent, and a blindness that Israel embarks on into this war, eventually developing not only the intelligence and cultivating the capabilities, but today Israel is obviously, the world's leading expert, obviously, on tunnel warfare. And sadly, I think, we both know that this is not the end of this, neither for Israel, and I would argue not for the West as well. Tunnels will be used in combat in the future. And what we saw here with Gaza is probably in a very large instance and example, but it won't be the last.
Yeah, no, I've listened and looked at those subterranean warfare conferences that have been held in Israel. And I follow some of the discussion about this. Um, as I see it, who knows? I mean, I think you see 30, 50%. Who knows how much of the tunnel structure they've actually gotten? And what amazes me is how the IDF has adjusted to this in terms of not only maneuvering underground, but also maneuvering with units above to coordinate their attacks on these tunnel systems. And quite extraordinary, quite extraordinary. Now, one of the things you say is your sort of prescriptions for this. You talk about reforming intelligence, bolstering the U.S.-Israeli alliance, improving public diplomacy efforts, preparing an exit strategy, which again, now that's where we get into an interesting problem here, because I don't particularly look at what's happened with this peace process. It could break apart in a heartbeat. Who's going to be the stabilization force going in to deal with Hamas? Hamas has emerged from the tunnels. I saw an IDF, and again, who knows what the real number is? They estimated 20,000 people had come up above the tunnels. They're estimating Hamas has 20,000. Again, I do not have any idea how to verify one way or the other these kind of estimates. I'm just referring to something that was in the Israeli press. And it's clear to me that they're fighting to reassert control in the areas they have. So who's going to go in and fight them? And to me, the uncertainty of all this gets into some of the prescriptions you have, because the idea that Netanyahu was putting forth throughout this conflict for the past 2 years was sort of total victory like 1945, that had come up and surrender. Well, it looks like that hasn't completely happened that way so far. And finally, you talk about strengthening national resilience. So just share with us some of these insights you have into what should happen in terms of reform on the part of Israel.
Well, I think in terms of preventing a similar attack in the future, I think that what Israel needs to do is it needs to obviously not fall back into a policy of containment and not allow for its enemies to rebuild and amass weapons in a way that it did in the past, right? That was the Israeli way, and the Israeli way led to the Hamas having not only tens of thousands of rockets and these hundreds of miles of tunnels, but also Hezbollah having an arsenal of about 150,000 rockets and missiles that were capable of striking anywhere inside Israel. Israel believed that it was preferable to avoid conflict, to kick the can down the road, and try to avoid war, even at the expense of knowing, because it knew that this was happening, that its enemies are building, they're amassing arms. And that was something that I think nowadays we understand today that can't go on. That's not that policy can no longer be policy. Instead, we need a policy of preemption, which means That the next time you see someone moving a rocket, you see someone digging a tunnel, you attack. You don't mark it down in a notebook and wait for the day that the war breaks out so you have a target bank. You preempt. And preemption is maybe the only way to really avoid these large types of wars in the future. And this is a dramatic change because Israel as a country has never operated on a policy of preemption for conventional military threats. It did so for nuclear, but not as it famously took out the 81 Osirak reactor being built by Saddam in 2007. My book tells the story of the bombing of Syria's nuclear reactor, but not for conventional military threats. So this is a sharp break from previous national security policy, but I think it's essential. There's other changes that are required as well. I think that we definitely have to do some intelligence restructuring and reforms. I don't know if I'd go as far as establishing the Directorate of National Intelligence, which was something that was done in the U.S. in the aftermath of 9/11 with the 9/11 Commission. But we need some changes because there were problems with the flow of information. There were problems with the politics between the different agencies. There's three primary agencies inside Israel. And we need just a better flow and more seamless work alongside one another. More of a focus on human intelligence, more of a focus on open source intelligence, less reliance just on signal intelligence. That was where Israel's primary intelligence was coming from for Hamas, and it got it wrong, right? The phone calls, the emails, it wasn't enough. And that's where Israel needs to do better. So there's a lot of different changes that we need to do, but I think that from a policy, there's no question that the preemption is probably the most dramatic one.
Well, okay, let's go back into Israeli policy in the 50s and 60s. I mean, one could argue that coming out of the War of Independence, one of the aspects of creating the whole force structure of the IDF was precisely to be able to wage a short war, even a preemptive war, if necessary. So if one looks at 56, there was a coincidence of interest between France and Britain, but sort of motivated Ben-Gurion to take advantage of that and join in the attack on Nasser to try to overthrow him in 56. And then the Six-Day War, okay, we could get into back and forth how that crisis evolved. But then, of course, when the Air Force unleashes its attack on Egypt, they were preemptively attacking. So in a way, to me,
67 might be the one single exception, although there's an argument to be made that it wasn't necessarily a classic case because there were already steps that Egypt was taking in the direction of war. But you're right. Without getting into the nitty-gritty, if we look at, besides for 67, if you look at Israel's conflicts, they've never been fought in that way. And definitely in the last 30, 40 years, if we look at the military buildup and the armament that's taking place along by Israel's enemies, primarily Syria, primarily Hezbollah, primarily Hamas, Israel has always held its guns and has not decided to engage unless it's first provoked.
Right. And obviously we have that international environment that constrains. And, you know, I remember many years ago, I listened to Michael Brecher give a talk on Israel's decision making in war. And one of the things he talked about was how as soon as Israel goes to war, you have a clock ticking about how international opinion is going to come down and restrain everything very quickly. So again, how do you prepare for this situation? And again, the issue of bolstering the U.S.-Israeli alliance, well, I don't have to tell you, you know, people in the United States are not too happy with the current president. And if people are going to sort of hitch their wagon to Donald Trump, you know, that could, of course, change. And so I think that, you know, look, I'm living in New York City right now. We're in the middle of this crazy election race here. So who the hell knows how that's going to happen? But one of the things that polling showed in New York City was that one of the things that did affect this was a change in perception about the Arab-Israeli conflict in terms of youth voting. That is clear. And in terms of preemption, I don't disagree, frankly, on my own personal feeling about Israel acting like that. The problem is, how do you draw the line? Because, you know, to me, again, the Monday morning quarterbacking, what really struck me in reading your book was at 7 o'clock in the morning, they ordered a general mobilization on October 7th. And that, of course, is the big triggering, you know, because if you want to sort of screw up the Israeli economy, you can obviously feint and engage in deception, then force the IDF to mobilize and then cause economic cost to Israel. So how do you then prevent that from happening with the kind of ideas you're talking about. I mean, you just simply depend on certain parts of the force structure to implement these kind of attacks. And then the issue of air power is another problem because air power, as good as it is, uh, always has its limitations. So, and again, the international environment is not the same as it was 15, 20 years ago. You have that, I don't have to tell you, it's a different kind of environment now to operate. So I'm wondering how you factor that into your idea of preemption.
Well, I mean, I think that there's dramatic changes that need to take place here, Jim, right? There's changes in force structure, there's changes in deployment, the vigilance that's required now, the focus on the different fronts that Israel faces. Israel will not be able to go back to just the defensive posture. This is all going to change a lot of the way this country has managed itself until now. Percentage of GDP that went into the defense spending. I mean, so much will have to change. If we go back to the Yom Kippur War, you saw GDP skyrocket for
Right,
defense,
right,
right? And it started to come down. It's now was
right,
just a few percentage
right.
points of the overall GDP. That's going to have to go back up now.
Right. They
And
demobilized all those divisions
right. So
in the 80s.
the country is really, I think, we're still in the thick of it
Right.
with the
Correct.
war, the ceasefire in place, but the war not really over. And the dramatic changes of what's going to happen. You're starting to see some of it. The amount of time reservists are serving, the compulsory military, the standing army, how much they're being asked to extend their service. The idea to shorten service is completely off the table. Has been shelved. They thought to go down from 3 years to 2.5 years. That's not going to happen. I mean, we're going in a completely different direction than where we thought, unless something else dramatic happens here. But I don't see that in the time being, for the time being, and therefore, this is something that's really going to impact and change Israel in the years to come.
How do you see? Let's talk about politics because, again, I want to just mention to our viewers While Israel Slept is a great, great read. I've looked at all these books that have come out. Yours is the best so far on this situation, the one that you and Amir did. And I hope that my personal feeling, I hope Netanyahu is ousted, and I hope that there can be a serious look at what happened because I know the IDF is doing that. We see little leaks of that. Units, different units are doing it. They're trying to do their own after action reports. Again, I have no idea the scope of it. I'm not there, you're there, so you have a better sense of it when people talk to you off the record. But to me, how do we get to a political settlement of this problem? Because during this whole period of time, you've had that conference going on with a two-state solution, which Netanyahu just said the hell with it. And you can tell me, I read Israeli opinion polls. I'm pretty aware of how belligerent everybody is and how angry they are about what happened, and I don't blame them. I mean, imagine if the United States had 40,000 people killed in one day, we would go
Yeah.
berserk. We'd go berserk. So, but
So I mean,
how can we get beyond this, man? How
so
can we get beyond this?
so with this, we'll call it, but
Right.
here's how I look at it. The war that broke out on October 7th was a great tragedy. Surprised Israel, great Israel number of casualties, the hostages, creating a situation unlike anything Israel's ever faced before, and brought a devastating war to the people of Gaza. That's really been tragedy. What's happened to Gaza and to the people of Gaza. I believe it's Hamas's fault. But I look at what's happened in the aftermath, and I see a re-engineering of the Middle East. The Iranian axis on the decline. Iran's air defenses destroyed, ballistic missile capability degraded, its nuclear infrastructure significantly set back. Syria, Assad is gone. Lebanon, Hezbollah degraded, weakened. Its leadership decimated, its long-range ballistic missile capability degraded. Hamas, a shadow of its former self. There's real opportunity today in the region. But what might happen with Lebanon, what might happen with Syria, what might happen with Iran with a new deal, these are rational actors, countries, entities that you could potentially deal with. Although in Lebanon, you have a strange reality where you have a government supported by the West and a terrorist guerrilla organization that undermines that government. We'll have to wait to see what happens there. But in Gaza, the real way forward, and there's a unique opportunity now, if we can get Hamas out of power, we can remove Hamas from the streets, we can take away the levers of power from Hamas, and then we can work to we being the world, this isn't Israel, the world can de-radicalize Gaza, change the education system, because let's face it, Jim, the people there are taught to hate me, to
Right.
want to kill my children. That's how
Right.
they're taught from and
Right.
people will say,
Right.
well, you got to look at the root of
No,
why
yeah,
the
no, you're
occupation.
right. No, you're
I'm
100%
not
right
even
about that.
going there
Yeah,
for a
yeah,
moment. I'm
yeah,
saying,
yeah,
listen,
yeah,
this is the reality.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
For that to change, you need a Marshall Plan, like what happened in Germany post World War II. You need a de radicalization plan that changes the education system, changes imams and mosques, changes newspapers, changes cultural institutions. This will take a long time. But when it does, that is the real way to peace. And when we think about it, and I've long been a proponent of the two-state solution, I would love to get there. I would love to find a way to live side by side. October 7th has taught me it's not possible right now. And it's
Mm.
probably not possible for the next 25 to 50, even 50 years. But if we want to get back on track, if we can use the next 25 years to de radicalize Gaza, West Bank, make changes that we have to do also inside Israel, that's the way that we can really forge a sustainable, powerful peace treaty in this region that can see the two peoples of Israelis and Palestinians live side by side. If we decide to skip the de radicalization, think that we're just going to sign on a bottom line and peace will come from the heavens,
Yeah.
it doesn't work. It
Right.
doesn't work. We've been down that road. It
Right.
doesn't work.
Right.
And so we need to do the real hard work. And when that real hard work is done, I think what we'll see is that people who today are skeptical will believe in this possibility and will believe that there is another way forward. But it requires hard, long work, investment, resources. That's the real great challenge ahead of us.
Well, and as I say, I've watched this at Columbia University now for several years, and I reject the idea that Columbia was an anti-Semitic institution. I consider that complete bullshit. However, the issue of talking to each other across these lines, I've seen that happen. But anyway, listen, Yaakov, it was great to talk with you. Yaakov Katz is the author of a terrific new book, While Israel Slept. Go buy it. It'll give you a really good insight into this conflict, and the dialogue continues. And Yaakov, thank you so much for taking the time today to talk to us.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks. You have a good day, man.
Take care.
Peace.